Number 1. At home. Yeah, this was a pretty weird thing that happened to me when I was a teenager. I really don't know how to explain it, really. My parents got divorced when I was about 10 years old. My dad wasn't interested in having custody, so I ended up living with my mom. It's what I would have preferred, so I felt fortunate. The only thing that ever bothered me about it was that my mom became a bit trampy after the divorce. I guess it didn't really bother. It is hard to explain exactly how it made me feel. I mean, I was happy for my mom. She didn't spend the time feeling sorry for herself. She moved on and found some things in life that made her happy. So it wasn't unusual for me to come home from school and she might have someone in the bedroom with her. On more than one occasion, I would get up in the middle of the night and I might run into her date coming back from the bathroom or something like that. So I was used to it. By the time I was 16, I'd experienced this sort of thing so often that I just didn't think about it anymore. It was normal, but there was one experience that left me a bit freaked out. I had been out late on a Friday night. There had been a football game at school, and I attended with my friends. After that, we went out to Wendy's and had dinner, before we all began walking home. I lived the furthest away of all my friends, so at one point I was walking alone. It didn't bother me though. When I was approaching our house, I noticed that all the lights were off. In fact, even the porch light was off, which was weird. My mom usually left it on if I was out, but I figured that perhaps she had one of her dates over, and maybe he had turned the light off. When I got closer to the house, I noticed a strange red light coming from the living room. It was really faint though, and I had no idea what it could have been. I let myself into the house, and immediately was in the living room. Sitting in the far corner of the room was a chair, and it was normally a chair no one ever used. But there was someone in the seat. I couldn't make him out really because it was so dark. But I did find out what the red light was. It was him smoking a cigarette, which I found odd. My mom wasn't big on inside smoking, but I figured she must have been sleeping, and he just got up for the smoke or something. I really didn't know. "Hey there," I said to him. He really didn't respond much. He moved the cigarette out of his mouth to acknowledge me. Other than that, he just sat there smoking. Well, I just figured the best thing to do at that point was to go to bed. I gave him a really quick, well, night, and headed off to my bedroom. Again, I was really unnerved by the guy, but it was simply just because he hadn't said anything. I got ready for bed, and it took me a little while to fall asleep. Once I did, though, I simply slept soundly through the night. The following morning, I was woken up by the smell of my mom making breakfast. It smelled great, and I figured it would be a good chance for me to once again see her companion from over the night. When I walked into the kitchen, I noticed my mom making dinner. I looked over at the table, and there was no one there. There was also only 2 place settings. I went to my seat as my mom told me good morning. I then asked her where her date was. She seemed really confused and asked me what was I talking about. I explained what I had seen to her, and the look on her face was unlike anything I'd ever seen in my life. "I didn't have a date last night," she told me. "Are you sure someone was in the house, or did you dream it?" I considered it for a minute. We then went into the living room and noticed that there were 5 cigarette butts that had been put out on the end table. My mom had absolutely no idea who was in the house the previous night. The encounter really frightened us. I mean, we were sleeping in the house with someone who wasn't supposed to be there. He didn't steal anything, and he didn't hurt us. But we just considered ourselves very lucky for that. He didn't come back. We never figured out who it was. But it was really the most frightening experience either of us has ever had, considering what might have happened that night. Number 2. The hospital. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. Long before it was cleaned out and opened as a tourist attraction, Waverly Hill Sanatorium just sat uninhabited for a long time. It was what I would call a relatively popular place for teenagers to go and drink beer, smoke pot, and have sex. It was pretty much known that the caretaker never prevented anyone from actually breaking into the place. Hell, many of us often wondered if there even was a caretaker, as it was easy enough to get into, and I had never really heard about anyone else running into him. I wasn't one much for doing drugs or drinking, and as much as I hate to admit it, as a teenager, no one really seemed to want to have sex with me. So, I'd never been out to Waverly for anything like that. But I did like the idea of haunted places, and there were a lot of stories about the abandoned hospital being haunted. I always felt like it has been difficult for me to get scared of anything. I thought breaking into a huge and abandoned and supposedly haunted hospital might do the trick. I'm not really sure how much of the stories that people have told about Waverly have any truth to them. I only even knew a few of them at the time. Much more have surfaced since then, which makes me wonder a little if they were just made up for tourist reasons. That's really not important though. It still was a huge and abandoned building in the middle of a densely forested area. Walking around in there alone could be intensely scary. I set out to the forest pretty early. Even though I was looking to get scared, I really didn't want to be out there after the sunset. Getting lost in the dense woods would have not been very pleasant. It took me a while before I found my way through the forest and onto the grounds of the hospital. The yard was not well mowed, and there was a whole lot of crap and garbage strewn all over the place. There were several ground-level windows that were broken out, so getting into the place was not too hard. Inside the building, it was really bad. There was a lot of leftover equipment, graffiti, garbage, and beer bottles all over the place. It was filthy, but it was also very creepy, which I took notice of immediately. When I left the room that I had entered the building in and looked down the hallway, I couldn't see the end of the hallway. There were tons of rooms. Many of the doors were open, and many of them were closed. The apprehension, the nervousness, began almost immediately, and I was enjoying it actually. Simply walking down the hallway, I knew it would be freaky. My goal was to find the area of the hospital known as the Death Tunnel. For those of you who might be familiar with Waverly, the Death Tunnel is a ramp and staircase that goes deep underneath the hospital. The story went that there were so many deaths at the hospital that occasionally the Death Tunnel would have been filled with bodies, taken down to a train to be removed from the hospital and eventually burned. I had a rough idea where it was, but didn't have any pictures or anything of the hospital, so I had to find it on my own. It was creepy walking around in that building. It was a kind of quiet that I really wasn't used to, and whenever there were noises, I really wasn't aware of what they were. My mind must have been playing tricks on me too, maybe even to the point of hearing sounds where no sounds were. Finally, though, I came to the Death Tunnel. It was foreboding. There was a lot of junk there too, but mostly I could not see to the end of it. It went pretty deep, and there was even a bit of mist in it. I had anticipated it being dark, so I had brought along a little flashlight. There were both stairs and a ramp leading down, but the ramp seemed wet and slippery, so I made sure to be on the stairs. I started walking down the stairs. It was freaky. The further I got down the tunnel, the freakier it was. But it was when I could no longer see the entrance to the tunnel behind me that I really began to feel real fear. A few times I almost turned around and went back, but I kept reminding myself this was the very reason I had come here to begin with. I avoided taking out the flashlight though, because I wanted to immerse myself in the whole experience, and it was when I got down far enough that I thought I began hearing something. It sounded like voices were coming from further down the tunnel. I have to admit pausing just a little when I did, but I knew it was just my imagination. It had already been scaring me. I kept walking down the steps, and then I could have sworn I once again heard voices, and so I stopped and listened for a few moments, and when I didn't hear anything, I then began walking down again, but I knew I was walking softly, even though I really didn't think there was anyone there. As I was walking softly in the dark, I then heard a very distinct voice very clearly say, "Just leave her here. No one's gonna find her. Let's get out of here." Right then, I heard footfalls on the ramp. I wasn't aware of how far away the bottom of the steps were, or what the voice was talking about, but I was worried. There was a lot of junk, like old wheelchairs on the ramp, and I found a way to just crouch down between a couple of them, so I would be out of any possible sight. The footfalls on the steps got closer, and closer, and it was very quickly. I tried to remain as quiet and still as possible. I did see a tiny little light, but it looked like it was no bigger than a pen light. I hoped they would not shine it on me. Two men eventually walked by me on the steps. They didn't seem to notice me at all, which was fortunate. However, they weren't really talking either. They just kept going up the steps. I really don't know how long I remained there, too scared to get up and move. I was too scared to make any noise. I waited, and I wasn't really sure how long I waited, and I kept thinking I should get up and go down to the bottom of the tunnel and see if someone was there. I also thought I should get up and get out of there as quickly as possible. Each time I thought this, I also thought I should wait longer. But finally, when I was able to convince myself to get up and go, I decided to go up the stairs. I don't really know if someone was down further, but I figured I could just call the police when I got home. I walked slowly up the stairs, my back to the side wall. I was too scared to have my back facing the back of the tunnel. I wondered if someone were down there. They could come up on me pretty quickly. I reached the top without incident. Once there, I quietly made my way back to the room that I had snuck into. I crept out and hadn't realized how long I had been in the tunnel until I noticed it was beginning to get dark. I quickly and nervously made my way off the grounds and back through the forest. I didn't feel comfortable until I got home. I did call the police anonymously and told them what I experienced. I followed the newspaper for several weeks, trying to see if anything was found there. Nothing ever was, though. I really don't know what I had experienced at that hospital. I don't know if anyone was found there, or if it was just an experience that I misinterpreted. But regardless, it was more terrifying than a ghost could ever be. Number 3. In the woods. When I was younger, I had a really frightening experience when I was at my grandma's house. I had a lot of cousins, and my grandma lived out in the country. It was fun to visit her, but a lot of the time there just wasn't very much to do. She didn't have cable TV or anything like that. There were really only a couple channels on the television, and none ever had anything on that any of the children would want to see. So we'd either play in the really big yard, or we'd explore out in the woods on the hills. We normally would go to Grandma's house around Easter time. All of my aunts and uncles and cousins would be there. Really, until I was much older, I never really remembered having Easter anywhere else. There was one year, though, when my parents weren't able to get the weekend of Easter off work. Now, we still plan on visiting Grandma, but we would be going the week before Easter. That meant that none of my cousins would be there, and I would have absolutely no one to play with. I really wasn't looking forward to it. And yeah, it was just as boring as I thought it would be. I wasn't getting a big thrill out of my parents and grandparents watching Days of Our Lives on a fuzzy television. Finally, I just decided I would go for a walk in the woods. If I was lucky, I'd find that entertaining, and it would pass the time. I'd been in the woods and on the hills by myself before. Also, I was 12 years old, so I was completely capable of going off on my own. So it wasn't even something anyone thought about. I have to admit, though, that I found myself to be slightly afraid after a while. My uncles used to tell me a story about some American Indians who were killed in battle back in those hills. Whenever the ground was covered with leaves, they would try and scare me by telling me that a dead American Indian would be somewhere under the leaves and ready to grab my ankle as I walked by. And being 12 years old meant I was right at that age when I could rationalize and not believe stories like that, but also still be a little scared of them too. The woods were quiet and very weird. There was no wind. There was an occasional animal noise, but they were a lot less common than usual. It could have been all in my head, I know, but I was seriously creeped out. There was also an occasional rustling of leaves that really sounded like someone else walking around out there. The first few times I heard it, I yelled out, "Hello?" But no one ever answered. As I was walking along, I noticed something out of place. Ahead of me, lying at the foot of a tree, nestled against a root, was like a pastel purple color. I was curious, and so I walked up to the tree. I was surprised to see a purple Easter egg laying against the root of the tree. And it wasn't rotted or anything. It looked like a fresh egg, and I just thought that was weird. I picked it up, felt it, and it was solid. I didn't know what to think, and I just put it back down. I walked a little further, and was surprised when I noticed another Easter egg. This one was yellow. It was so weird, seeing these out here in the middle of nowhere. I didn't pick this one up, and I just kept going. At the top of the hill, I stopped. I was by a large tree, but 2/3 down the hill, I saw something that I had never seen before. A large person dressed up in a ratty rabbit costume. From as far away as I was, the costume looked moldy and disgusting. And the bunny was carrying something. It looked like it was taking the object and hitting it against a tree over and over again. I did a double take when I realized that the person in the costume was taking the body of a white rabbit and hitting it against the tree over and over. I was in shock at first, not sure what I was seeing. I mean, there are some weird, demented people in the world, but this seemed nearly cartoonish. But it wasn't just cartoonish. It was really disturbing. I couldn't pull myself away at first, until I began to think about what might happen to me if this weirdo noticed me watching him. I backed up and began walking down the hill. It was hard walking that way, but I didn't feel comfortable with my back to that weird scene I had just seen. I did actually pick up one of the eggs too. I really wanted to tell my family what had happened. I had some weird fantasy in my head of the guy coming after me to get the egg. But he didn't. My family, they completely believed me. My grandpa told me there were some really weird people out in the hills. It would be a good idea for me not to go back out alone. I never did. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. And if you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment to let me know what you thought of the video, and please share it with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original horror story that you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most important, make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.